This is where the cool kids are, the research stage. This is where they put us so we don't bother anybody else, you know? Okay. Are we ready? Are you guys ready to have your minds blown? So this is going to be a talk about execution consensus separation. These blue squares are going to be proposers. Each of them is going to have transactions in their blocks. We're going to merge them into one set by taking the union of all those transactions. There was a duplicate transaction, so we deduped it. And then we're going to order them based on a deterministic rule. Dan Robinson's favorite is this one, which is pretty good, this descending order of priority fee. So this is the basic idea, and then the question is, how do we actually get from this picture into something that works for Ethereum that has safety, liveness, and good MEV properties? So let's get into that. So Braid is a consensus protocol which is kind of substrate agnostic, so it can be used with something like an LMD Ghost. It can be used with something like Hot Stuff or Tendermint. It's a way to combine a single threaded blockchain consensus mechanism into one that has multiple leaders. This is early stage work. It's joint work with Malesh Pai, Alberto Sanino, Joaquim New, and Joe Banu, who's not on here. But he's a recent addition. And the interesting thing about this set of people, Malesh, game theorist, Alberto and Joaquim are consensus experts. I'm more on the game theory side. And Joe, who we just added to the team as well, is a cryptographer. So it's kind of an interdisciplinary work because we needed the tools from all of those disciplines. And you're going to see some of the cryptography that we've been working on in the last month, in the last few slides, because we ended up needing more cryptography than we thought we would at the start. But it's been a great experience so far because we're learning so much from each other. And I think this is the kind of research that blockchain needs more, less siloed, all consensus people working on consensus stuff, and more interdisciplinary work, but with extreme formality. So preliminaries, most of you know that blockchains are typically leader-driven. Ethereum has a leader every 12 seconds. They rotate. They decide everything that goes into the block and in what order they go into the block. So the power implications of this are that leaders tend to get a lot of revenue. You may have seen close to $1 billion of proposer revenue through the MEV Boost auction every year. That's downstream of these implications. And it makes it really difficult to build apps that provide MEV resistance in this architecture because you have to grapple with the fact that the proposer has so much power over what gets included that they can try to manipulate your mechanism in a way that's not necessarily desirable. So that's why I would say censorship resistance is all you need, because there's a lot of ordering rules that you can do. But if you don't have censorship resistance, then all of those ordering rules are going to be subject to manipulation. So in this censorship resistance, all you need post. This was a 2015 post. I thought it was 2016, but it's actually 2015 post. So Vitalik is early as always on these things. Vitalik wrote that short-term censorship resistance was very important for financial applications. And so in the post, he wrote that censorship resistance isn't just about letting Silk Road operate on chain, which I guess was their version of OFAC and Tornado Cash back then. It's also about having credible neutrality for applications. And he gave this example of an option exercise contract that didn't really work if you didn't have short-term censorship resistance. And we kind of started on this problem from a different tack. We were looking at this problem of LVR, of arbitrage rents going to the proposers, and we were like, why don't you just run an auction? Say you have a $1,000 arbitrage opportunity, why don't you just auction the right to take that off? Well, the key problem with doing that is that the proposer gets to run the auction. Because if there's a $1,000 opportunity available, they can censor all other bids, submit a 1 cent bid, and win the opportunity for themselves. So the key finding of our paper in 2023, censorship resistance in on-chain auctions, was that you couldn't run an auction on-chain with the current architecture of Ethereum as it is today without leaking substantial rent and corrupting the auction. And so we said, well, how can we increase censorship resistance so that you can run these auctions and so that you can build up apps that mitigate MEV? And the solution was allow more than one person to submit transactions in a single slot. So multiple concurrent leaders or multiple concurrent proposers is a solution to solving MEV or killing MEV in the long run, because it means applications are empowered to capture and run auctions themselves. And once you can do that, you can really do a lot on the application side. So here are some other proposals that have talked about improving Ethereum CR. Fossil inclusion lists, which there were several talks about this week. In that world, it's a fork choice and forced inclusion list. There are several inclusion list proposers. They propose an inclusion list ahead of time, like a few seconds ahead of when the beacon proposer proposes. And then those proposals are circulated along the gossip network. And by the time a proposal happens, the fork choice enforces that the beacon proposer includes enough of those inclusion lists. Because if they don't include enough of those inclusion lists, then the attesters will not attest. So the problem with this is that it's like 3 seconds or so delayed, enough time for these inclusion lists to propagate through the peer-to-peer layer. And if you talk to the authors, a lot of the goal behind these, they don't want them to become corrupted by MEV. It's more for like the kind of Silk Road style, OFAC style censorship resistance. And they're really trying to specify a set of transactions that are not MEV transactions. So it's not really trying to solve the same problem. And then there's this idea that's a little bit older of protocol enforced proposer commitments. A proposer can commit to some features of the block. I think the problem is the type of commitment you might want is that if you see my transaction and it pays enough fee, you would include it. So that type of commitment is very hard to enforce because of this problem of forensic support. It's very difficult to find a transaction that was censored and provably show that it was censored without a ton of overhead. And then there are these ideas of vote extensions, which are kind of a similar idea to what Fossil and inclusion list looks like, but more for a Tendermint style BFT consensus protocol. And so that's like ABCI++ on Cosmos. We made a proposal called Multiplicity, which was similar to this. And it has the same problem of the view canonicalizer having a last look and taking a bunch of rent from that. So our take is like, these are kind of gadgets. They're trying to cure some of the symptoms. Maybe if we just tackle the problem head on, eat the complexity, we can improve the whole system and not have to deal with a bunch of different gadgets putting them in there. So first of all, like, we should formally define what censorship resistance is, because if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So, and that's a Shriram quote, by the way. So definite, but it's probably somebody else's quote before that, but that's the one I heard it from. So a public bulletin board is kind of an abstraction of a blockchain. So we need to start with an object that can be censorship resistant. It has two operations, write, which takes two inputs, message and tip. And it has read, which just returns all the messages that have been successfully written. So core aspect of this definition that I would draw your attention to is that the write operation has a tip in it. And a lot of the other definitions that you'll see of censorship resistance on the web or in other people's work will be no tip included. And I think the tip is like very important to understand what's going on with censorship resistance, especially for MEV protocols, because tips change. And even for like something like a Tornado Cash, it's much more expensive to censor a Tornado Cash transaction with a $100 tip than it is to censor it with 10-cent tip. And so clearly this should be coming into the definition in some way. So once we have this bulletin board, we can talk about a definition of what it means for the bulletin board to be censorship resistant. This is going to be a function phi, that little squiggle is phi, and it takes as input the tip of the transaction and outputs the minimum cost it would take a motivated adversary to censor the transaction. And what we showed in our censorship resistant in on-chain auction paper is that you can achieve dramatically increased censorship resistance by instituting multiple concurrent proposers. So you can get here, we have a linear increase with some conditional tipping. You can get even better than a linear increase. And so this was something that said, hey, wait, why are we not doing this today on Ethereum? Because we could do this with multiple proposers. So the answer to why we're not doing it is because we didn't have a credible proposal, which is why we decided to basically search for one. So we looked at some other approaches. We looked at, what if we just take LMD Ghost with multiple proposers? So this is slightly different than what we're going to show later. Problem with this is that fork choice can explode, and an adversary with a small percentage of the network can cause forks in repeated slots and create a really large fork choice tree that just has to be pruned at some point. And that, I guess, in theory, if you had infinite memory and infinite compute to like resolve these fork choice stuff, it probably would work eventually. But in practice, it's probably not a good idea, and probably the implementations would introduce a bunch of attacks that would be possible by even a small percent of stake. And then Mysticetti is on Sui, and they're in production, I think, but they're limited in how many testers they can handle because of the communication complexity. And we have a lot of testers on Ethereum, so we need something that is friendly to vote aggregation and all of the technology that we have to deal with those on Ethereum today. So here's a picture that kind of goes over the architecture, and I think the critical thing to see in this picture is that each block only has a reference to the previous block in its subchain. So in a DAG protocol, you would see block 4 on subchain 3 would have a connection to block 3 on subchain 2, and maybe block 3 on subchain 1 as well. So those cross chain messages create like some rigidity in the structure, but they also increase the communication complexity. And we didn't necessarily want to do that, and we wanted to inherit a lot of the properties of the underlying consensus mechanism, like LMD Ghost. So we had to change a minimal number of things. Because the goal for Braid was really, how do we get a minimum viable consensus protocol that achieves multiple proposers? And so having these directly backwards pointing arrows only means that the corruption of the fork choice tree by an adversary is isolated onto one subchain. And that means all of the properties that we know about what that corruption can do, our reorg resilience properties, our consensus liveness and safety properties, are going to be preserved. So let's talk about what we're going to do. Formally, we're going to run K separate parallel chains using the same validator set. So this is something that a lot of people are confused about when they first hear about Braid, and mostly probably because we haven't written down the spec and put it out for you guys. But the same validator set means that all validators are participating in consensus on all the chains. That means we're not splitting up into like 10 different validator sets and having them each do one chain. Actually, everybody's working on all of the chains at the same time and attesting to all of them. All chains are synchronized, which means they have the same slot times in the real world. So slot I is like a common slot across all chains. That means in subchain 1 we have something at slot 256, and subchain 2 we have something at slot 256, and the proposal deadlines for those are the same. And the block is not necessarily a object of communication in this case. It is the union of the objects of communication. The block that we're going to execute is the union of all transactions in slot I from all K chains. So after we form consensus on the union, execution and state transition occurs using an agreed upon deterministic rule, for example, decreasing order of priority fees, which is a great rule. And that is the gist of the protocol. Let me talk about some straightforward properties. So liveness is like incredibly obvious, because if any one of the chains is live, then we're progressing the state. Consistency is a lot more complicated, but here's a sketch of what happens. So if each chain is eventually consistent, that means all honest replicas eventually have the same view informally. And if each of those chains is eventually consistent, then we can do some math and we can extend that property to the whole system is eventually consistent. So that means eventually, at the pace of the slowest chain, all honest replicas have the same view of the whole system. What does that mean when all honest replicas have the same view of the whole system? Well, it means we can run some Byzantine agreement protocol. One of the properties of Byzantine agreement protocol is when all honest replicas have the same view going into it, they get the same output. And so we can form basically a finality gadget on the whole system. So the key of Braid is we have these individual subchains. They're operating on the unfinalized head individually. And then when we reach eventual consistency, we run a Byzantine agreement protocol and we finalize. So that's kind of the gist of it. This is some new material now. So I've given this talk before. A lot of what was on the previous pages was in previous talks. This is new material that we've been working on. So we were talking about this simultaneous release property, which is really an MEV property that's required for all of the app level things that we want to do. There are two versions of this. There's a weak simultaneous release, and we have like these formal epistemic game theory things that are like 2 pages long, but try to summarize these in as few words as possible. So the weak simultaneous release says that proposers do not know the context of other people's blocks before they propose their own block. So in some sense, we all have our block, we put it in an envelope that nobody else can see, we send it off, and then when it's time to reveal, we reveal them, and nobody could change their view of what was in the blocks. They cannot overwrite what they proposed already based on information. So let's think about this in terms of like poker. Like let's think of a modified version of poker where everybody bets during the hand at the same time. So in that version of poker, like you don't necessarily know what your opponent bet, so you have to play some mixed strategy, and you basically have to bet based on the hand that you have. And when you start to see what other people bet, you start to get a lot of advantages. So for those of you who know poker strategy, being in position, which means acting last, is extremely valuable, and you're supposed to play more hands, weaker hands, so you can get in position and make money off of that. So that's why this weak simultaneous release is important. There's a epsilon strong simultaneous release definition, which is, it includes the weak property. So it's like a subset of protocols that satisfy strong simultaneous release, satisfy weak simultaneous release. But it also says that the difference in the amount of additional information from the outside world is bounded by epsilon. So we're going to propose at a similar wall clock time is what this basically says. And this is the key difference between something like a fossil with some cryptography commit reveal bonded onto it and what Braid is the difference in how big that epsilon is. So yeah, that's the basic idea. Let's go back to our poker example. We're playing a poker game where everybody submits bets at the same time, so you don't see what other people bet. That's a good game. You probably get more equity value out of your hand more uniformly than in regular Texas Hold'em. But what if somebody saw an extra street? They saw, say, you only see the flop and your opponent sees the river. That person would be able to make a lot more money off of you in that game because they have extra information. And so what this is about is like limiting the extra Binance information that any of these proposers have. So how can we achieve this? Well, we have 4 different possible proposals for how to do this. So let me go through them. Commit reveal is just I commit the digest of my block, and then later I reveal it. So this is going to require a 2-stage approach, which we haven't been super allergic to in the past. There's some of the ePBS proposals require a 2-stage. The key problem with commit reveal is that you have to put up some bond, some stake that says, if I don't reveal, or if I like just choose to go offline or whatever, then I need to pay for my impact on the protocol for doing that. And when it comes to MEV, there are these long tail opportunities, and so we need to set the bond very high to capture those long tail opportunities, but we can't set it too high because you might just go offline by accident and then you might get a huge penalty. And so you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place on these long tail opportunities with commit reveal, and so that's one of the disadvantages of it. So what if we modify it so that if you don't reveal, we have this ability to force open your commitment. So how does that work? I'll go to the next slide because this is what it's about. So blocks are time lock encrypted, which is a way to encrypt something in like a time lock puzzle that opens after you do some non-parallelizable computation. And in the happy path, it's just like commit reveal, where proposers reveal their committed blocks, and there's no need to compute a time lock puzzle, which can be expensive, would require everybody to have ASICs. In the unhappy path, watchdogs who have the time lock ASICs force decrypt the block and execute it as normal. So that means you can no longer do these kinds of attacks where you submit a very large trade, have a kind of 2-second option to decide whether or not you want to take that trade, and if you don't take it, you just don't reveal, because if you don't reveal, the chain might slow down a bit, but you're still going to get executed, and so that trade is still going to go through, and this solves a lot of the kind of MEV, long-tail MEV problems. So let's go on threshold. Threshold is another option. It's going to require, I think, an additional round, and it starts to get in. I kind of ordered these in terms of simplicity of the cryptography. The threshold starts to get rough because there's some unsolved problems of whether you can do threshold without trusted setup. And again, we have an additional round. The way that threshold works is we take our information, we shred it into a bunch of pieces, and then if you have enough of those pieces, you can open the encryption. So that's nice because it means kind of everybody can see all the blocks and then open them up, which is a good property. That's a pretty good candidate right now. And then there's a fourth thing, which is delay encryption. Delay encryption is this kind of like moon mathy thing where you have a time lock puzzle that has a private key and public key, and you can encrypt to its public key, and then the private key will be eventually revealed, and once the private key is revealed, everybody at the same time gets to see what was in the blocks. So this is kind of the ideal mechanism from a formal perspective for what we'd like to see in Braid is delay encryption, but it's a little bit moon mathy as of today. So hopefully some people in the audience, some of you researchers, get to work on delay encryption. Okay, so that's basically all I had. This is what we're going to have our main suggestion be for now, if we were to implement this today, would be this commit reveal force open scheme, because we know how to do it with time lock. And keep in mind, time lock is not the same as VDF. So VDF and time lock are different because VDF implies a verifiable randomness beacon. Time lock does not do that. And so it's actually a lot simpler. We have known techniques for it. It's not a moon mathy thing. These repeated squaring things kind of work pretty well for it. And if you get it a little wrong and they can get a few like milliseconds of faster time lock, it shouldn't matter in the commit reveal force open, because you can make the force open period long. So you can make the time it takes for even the best ASICs to decrypt the blocks even longer than the slot time. And it would mean that you do slow down the chain, the speed of execution, but it wouldn't mean necessarily that you could ever see somebody else's blocks. You never violate this weak simultaneous release property, which is super important. Okay, that's all I had for my presentation. Happy to take any questions. Behind you, Dan. Yeah, you. Sorry.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask with this commit, because you said this is probably the best direction you'll take to have a mechanism with a simultaneous release property. Do we see any like mechanisms like today that have implemented like something that uses this approach?
I don't know of any off the top of my head. I think there's this is the first kind of thing where this property, I don't know if anybody else has kind of formally written it out and talked about what was required for it. I think Joe, who's the cryptographer on the paper, has done some stuff around it with some voting schemes, but I'm not sure if he's used this exact idea of commit reveal force open. I would have to take a look there.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have an estimate for how low epsilon actually is in Ethereum consensus? Because my impression would be that in Ethereum consensus, actually proposers have a decent amount of leeway in how long they can take to produce their blocks, and there are several last mover advantages that you might have if you control validators in terms of canceling at least a block after it's been proposed.
Well, I don't think it's fair to look at like today's situation where some people are proposing at 0 seconds and others are proposing at 3.5 seconds as like what it would look like in Braid, because that is a consequence of like a misguided attempt to use altruism to build a protocol and like try and like hold on to the timing games rather than just let them go. And so there are a lot of like client teams that work on this stuff that are like morally think that it's wrong to play timing games, and it doesn't mean that like they can't propose their block later. It just means they're not proposing their block later because somebody told them like, oh, actually it's like blasphemous to propose your block later. There are people proposing at 3.5 seconds right now. Kiln is proposing 3.5 seconds right now. Anytime you talk to like an actual validator team, like they will say like, oh, like the number one thing we think about is whether this will make our block like harder to propagate. So I would say the estimate in Ethereum today, I mean, like, why don't we just look at the estimate in Solana that has like a reasonable slot time, right? Like, it's pretty reasonable to say in Solana people are proposing within 400 milliseconds because their slot time is 400 milliseconds, right? They're proposing at least within there, but they're proposing, you know, near the end of that slot too.
You mentioned briefly using randomness beacons. Is there a reason to use the time lock ASIC style versus a randomness beacon like DRAND? Because it seems to me that this incentivizes building an ASIC farm to try to gain an advantage over the randomness beacon like DRAND, where there is no way to, unless you override half the network, to beat the randomness.
Well, the thing about these time lock puzzles is that they're not parallelizable. So building a farm will not help you. What matters is like having the fastest chip that has the highest like clock speed, because it's single. It has to be single threaded. And so the reason that I'm talking about ASICs is because we don't know of a non-ASIC time lock puzzle. So what that means is there exist ASICs that will do it much faster than like your CPU. That means we have to calibrate the time lock puzzle for the fastest ASIC that we know of. What I was saying earlier is that we have extra leeway because we're not delaying consensus on the happy path. So most of the time people are just revealing as normal. So we can set that extra leeway and be very sure that even the fastest ASIC doesn't decrypt before 100 milliseconds or something.
Max, so I didn't understand something about how the time lock encryption and the consensus protocol integrate. So are you waiting to reveal until after finality is reached? Because finality if you're applying Braid to protocols that take a long time to reach finality, then the security property there is not entirely clear. And it seems also like this is limited to synchronous protocols, or that protocols that basically have like produce a block on like a regular wall clock time, and I'm wondering whether it would work with asynchronous protocols, and generally the ones that have fast finality are asynchronous.
I mean, I don't have a formal statement, but I would say that the slots themselves seem quite important for the economic properties that we want, like the simultaneous release with a protocol like Mysticetti that has like that you can have blocks coming out at any time. It just doesn't seem to work together to me very well. So my intuition is that you probably need slots. Maybe I'm wrong, but I would guess that having the simultaneous release means you need timeouts so that people actually release. And then on your second question, or maybe it was your first question, the way it would work in this is you would have, block one would be commit your block. Block two would be reveal your block. block 3 would be commit your block. Block 4 would be reveal your block. So it's this kind of 2-stage. So we end up using, you know, the unfortunate part about that is you end up using an extra set of blocks. You could do it together, so you could have commits and reveals in the same blocks. Issue would be that you don't actually know what the state is when you're building the block. So having the commit reveals in separate blocks means that you can know what the state is, or at least have a good estimate of what the state is when you're doing MEV.
But are you waiting for finality? So
No.
You're not waiting for finality. Okay, so there is a risk that somebody can, based on a reveal, then propose a different block, right?
Well, that's where the slot time timeouts come in, right? Is that like if
Well, but the information is not committed. So like normally with the way that you would use a commit reveal or time lock encryption to do an encrypted mempool on top of Consensys is you would reveal only after the transactions are committed, right? But here you're actually revealing before the transactions are committed.
I mean, the blocks in, I think, because of the, so you send out your commitment in period 1 here, and then in period 2 you're sending out your reveals. It's impossible to propose a new block with more information in period 2 because the timeout has already happened.
Right, no, but the blocks that were proposed in period 1 aren't finalized yet. So you could try to propose a different block that would overwrite that.
You could try, but the attesters are going to time you out, right? I guess maybe. You
Well, I'm
could
just
try to
saying,
do a
like with
balancing
Ethereum,
attack,
like
yeah.
you have short forks, right?
Yeah. I think we're hoping that we can do some kind of like treatment for the like Goldfish has the treatment for the balancing attacks built in because the view changes all happen at the same time, and I think that might help with this. Happy to chat more about this since there's definitely a lot in there.